We got some promising updates on Tyler Kasak and Greg Kerkvliet, but when should we expect them to compete again? And any criticism of Joe Sealey to this point is absolutely unjustified.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked on to Penn State Wrestling. Thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. My name is Zach Seyko, and I am your host of the show. Status report updates on Tyler Kasak, Greg Kerkvliet, Joe Sealey, as well as Cael Sanderson provided some insight into his true freshman season. And then the new scholarship rules that are going to be happening sooner rather than later, how that affects Penn State wrestling. As always, your comments, your thoughts are appreciated down below. Let's talk about Tyler Kasak and Greg Kerkvliet. So Greg Kerkvliet is actually pretty simple. Best case scenario, he was dealing with an illness. Cael Sanderson in his press conference this week stated how that the team is just routinely dealing with in-season illnesses, and Greg Kerkvliet is one of the wrestlers that is dealing with them specifically, so he was held out of the dual meets this week. So nothing serious, nothing to be concerned about. I imagine that with senior night coming up this Friday against American University, that he will be back in the lineup, no issues, and then just to kind of get him situated for the Big Ten tournament, but he doesn't need that matchup against American University, but it's also nice to face some outside competition one more time. They do get a break. Remember that. They do get a break between senior night and then the Big Ten tournament itself. So there's no more competition. There's no more dual meets or anything before the Big Ten tournament. They got a 2-week gap after American University. Tyler Kasak, though, dealing with concussion. The concussion. He's in concussion protocol, sustained it against Maryland. And I talked about this in a previous episode. So Cael Sanderson at least gave us a promising update in the fact that he's doing well. He's progressing well. He made the joke about how they almost have to keep him away from overexerting himself, from competing too much, because he wants to be out there. He called him a physical specimen. So meaning that he's healing properly. He's doing very well. I don't expect him to wrestle against American University, and here's why. I'm not a concussion expert, but just from what I know about from injuries in general, it doesn't even have to do with college athletics, but injuries in general, a concussion is typically about a 4 to 5 week timeline. And right now, Tyler Kasak seems to be following that if you want to go with the safe measure. I remember what Cael Sanderson said from not this press conference, but a week prior, where that Braeden Davis and Tyler Kasak, hey, if there was a Big Ten tournament on the line, if it was the NCAA tournament, those guys would probably be out there on the map. But you have this time, and we saw Braeden Davis return. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes here. But Tyler Kasak for a concussion, it's a 4-week ordeal. So sustained it against Maryland. That one, there's the 1 week going into missing the likes of Ohio State and Illinois. Then the second week, missing American University. The third week, that upcoming week where there's nothing. So he's going to go into the Big Ten tournament cold, but think of that as his tune-up period. So there's that 4-week timeline. By the time they reach the Big Ten tournament, that's the 4-week protocol. So he's still practicing. He's still training. I saw him around the mat room. So Tyler Kasak is okay, and he's doing well from what Cael Sanderson said, but don't expect him to be out there against American University. That's my opinion. That's my intuition. Maybe that's different because I didn't expect to see Braeden Davis against Ohio State or Illinois, and there's a reason that he was out there. We'll get to that in just a second. For Kasak, though, I don't think he doesn't need to prove anything against American University. So Greg Kerkvliet, fortunately, he's only dealing with an illness. There's no injuries involved or anything like that, but he doesn't need to prove anything against American. However, it is senior night. Tyler Kasak's not a senior. He is a true sophomore. So he doesn't have that. It's not that moment for him, if you will. Bo Bartlett and Kerkvliet and Carter Starachi. And I really hope I'm not missing anybody in the lineup. But I think Penn State is going to have its regular senior night, but Tyler Kasak is not going to be a part of that because concussions are serious. Penn State's going to follow the routine timeline here of 4 weeks. And by the time that 4 weeks is up, boom, you're at the Big Ten tournament. So it all kind of perfectly lines up together for Kasak to be well rested, and his tune-up moment will be the Big Ten tournament to go into NCAAs. Let's get to Braeden Davis, because Davis surprisingly wrestled, and for what it's worth, did do well. Lucas Bird is not just a fringe All-American. You could argue that Nick Bozakis is, but that's still respectable competition, and that's what most people categorize Braeden Davis as is, yeah, he can get on the podium, but we expect him to be around 6th, 7th, or 8th. We don't think that he'll be in the top 4, and he's definitely not going to be at the NCAA championship. Okay, that's the chatter. For Braeden Davis, he proved quite a bit. To go out there ice cold after not wrestling for a few weeks and to defeat All-America competition in Nick Bozakis, to score 8 points when Braeden Davis isn't really recognized as an offensive wrestler. I know he struggled against Lucas Bird, but it really doesn't get any tougher than that. Bird is somebody that I expect to get to the semifinals, if not the final. I put Bird as one of those top 4 wrestlers at 133. See if Ryan Crookham wrestles in the postseason. I hope so, just for the sake of competition. Braeden Davis impressed me a lot by going out there, defeating a Bozakis, first match that he's faced, and then Lucas Bird humbles him, but you have to expect that because of the conditioning factor, because he's not going to be back to 100%. And the reason he wrestled, even though he's not 100%, is because you can't pass up the opportunity to wrestle that kind of competition against a different caliber of opponent. Illinois and Ohio State, those are Big Ten dual meets. Those are also wrestlers that you're probably going to face in the Big Ten tournament and very well could face in the NCAA tournament as well. This was too important of an opportunity for Braeden Davis to miss. Okay, so you get that extra bit of rest. So you get that little percentage. So instead of being, let's say for conservative sake, let's say Braeden Davis is 85%. Let's say Braeden Davis, because he didn't look 100%. For better or for worse, he did not look 100%. Let's say he's 85%. So okay, he gets 90, 95%. He gets another weekend off. But to wrestle Nick Bozakis when he's not at 100%, to wrestle Lucas Bird when he's not at 100%, to get an idea of where he is on his timeline for recovery, that is invaluable compared to, well, you get another weekend off and you're going to face those wrestlers. It's different compared to Tyler Kasak. When Kasak, you can't prove anything against American University because there's not an All-America caliber wrestler waiting at 157. You could see Lucas Bird in the Elite Eight. You could see Lucas Bird or Nick Bozakis in the Big Ten semifinals or the Big Ten finals at 133. So I completely understand why. And also for lineup's sake, it was honestly strategic to put out. Hindsight's 2020, but with Luke Lillidahl getting pinned and then 6 points going in the favor of Ohio State, Kyson Garcia against Nick Bozakis, I got to imagine that would have been at least a major decision. Then it's 10-0. Braeden Davis goes out there and gets 3 points back for Penn State. So instead of it being 10-0, it is now 6-3, and the dual meet score is in a much different spot. So Braeden Davis provided a lot of things there for the lineup, but he also gets the experience. He gets to see where he is, and he gets back up to speed a little sooner. His clock begins earlier now, and Penn State knows what they're doing. They know what his recovery is. They know how he's feeling. He probably could have used the weekend off. Don't get me wrong. But I think it's more important that he wrestles against a guy like Bozakis, a guy like Bird back-to-back, because you're going to see that in the postseason very, very soon. Joe Sealey has been dealing with an injury of his own. It's undisclosed, but he also went through a surgery, and he's still wrestling. Any criticism that is thrown his way is unjustified. It's downright wrong. We'll talk about it more on the other side of this break. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now, Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on intuitturbotax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees. That is turbotax.com/guarantees. Joe Sealey doesn't deserve any sort of criticism. If anything, he deserves praise, and his expectations should be loftier. That's how I see it. I think my expectations for Joe Sealey went higher after learning. So we did get word. If you've been listening to this podcast, you knew that Joe Sealey was dealing with an undisclosed injury. We didn't know what it was, what his timeline or anything like that. But then Cael Sanderson gave us another insight to what's been going on with Sealey. He had surgery. Now, it was a minor surgery. According to Cael Sanderson, this was something that it was a minor surgery, but he's out there competing. Let's not just brush this off as, okay, even if it's not a major procedure here and something that definitely deems him out for the season. The fact that a true freshman goes through this kind of adversity and then is able to work his way into the lineup this quickly, because from what it sounds like, it doesn't sound like he's been practicing a lot this season. It doesn't sound like he's been competing to full capacity. We know that now. It's confirmed. But the sample size for Joe Sealey is even smaller than this, and he's able to make his way into the lineup and get the spot start as it is. The criticism's not warranted. It's harsh, because I understand it though. You watch this matchup, and it was 10-1 against Ohio State. And he doesn't look good. He looks exhausted because he hasn't gone through that conditioning. He hasn't wrestled for this entire season. He hasn't been practicing. He hasn't been going through the gauntlet. He's not only been recovering from a surgical procedure, he also has to, like a Braeden Davis and eventually like a Tyler Kasak, is going to have to get readjusted. And he not even readjusted. He hasn't been adjusted, period, because he hasn't faced outside competition. It's just practice. Practice is a lot different than doing the actual thing of wrestling an actual match. So for Joe Sealey to crack the starting lineup when he's supposed to be at 165, so he makes the weight cut. He's projected at 165. I've seen that he's supposed to move up maybe to 174 after all of this, or that's his trajectory. And then he slots in at 157, and against Ohio State, doesn't look that great. Okay, that's his first collegiate match when he's coming off of a surgery and hasn't been practicing the entire time. Then responds against Illinois a day later, should have won. Should have won that match. That's a takedown. You don't make the call on the mat and then overturn it. I understand if Cael Sanderson thought there was 3, they don't get the call, they throw the brick and then video replay, right? You kind of confirm, but you need more evidence that says it's against what the call is on the mat in order to overturn it. Referees didn't get the memo at that. Andrew Rivera, notorious for it. So whatever have you, Joe Sealey gets robbed of his first collegiate takedown, his first collegiate win. But that shows me the grit, the toughness that goes along with being a top 10 pound for pound recruit. So if you are ready to write off Joe Sealey, you're going to be in the wrong crowd, because I think Joe Sealey is an extremely talented wrestler, a very special one that has a bright future at Penn State. But he needs time. He's already overcoming this adversity as a true freshman in his first season with the program. He's only going to get better. He's only going to get stronger. He's only going to get smarter. And to deal with all of this right away when he doesn't have to start. He doesn't have to be the starter anytime soon. And he's allowed to develop and go through the training that is necessary to make him the best of the best. Same thing with Cole Mirasola. Let's bring him into this conversation as well. No, he's not dealing with an injury, but he's dealing with a developmental process that limits him. Cole Mirasola is giving up 30 to 40 pounds, if not more, against this competition. The guy was wrestling at 97 kilograms. I've said this before, and I want to point it out again. Mirasola was not a heavyweight when he came to Penn State. He was wrestling at about 210, 215 pounds, give or take, with international freestyle and where he was at high school. His brother wrestling right below him at 92 kilos, and he's settling in at that 197-pound weight class. We know Josh Barr's the starter, but both the Mirasola twins are redshirting. For Cole Mirasola, though, he's never going to wrestle at 285. He doesn't need to. Greg Kerkvliet doesn't even wrestle at 285, but he wrestles above, at 250? I think he's at 255. Maybe he's at 260. He's definitely in that 250 to 260 range. In order for Mirasola to get to that, to put on natural weight, because you don't want to put on weight just for the sake of putting on weight, because then you won't be able to wrestle. You will definitely be behind not just one step, but 2, 3, 4, 5 steps against these other elite competitors. And for what it's worth, Mirasola went up against 2 All-American caliber wrestlers, and Nick Feldman has been dealing with injuries himself. He could easily find his way into the semifinals at the heavyweight spot in NCAAs. I think he'll face Greg Kerkvliet in the championship at Big Tens and then possibly get to the semifinals. Nick Feldman is that good. Luke Luffman is an All-America contender of Illinois. And Mirasola did not get majored. He did not get tech-falled. He held his own. And honestly, if it wasn't for the clock, he probably would have scored a takedown against Luke Luffman of Illinois on Sunday. So there is a lot to like between Joe Sealey and Cole Mirasola. They are developing extremely well despite the circumstances. Despite wrestling 40 pounds under the competition, Mirasola is holding his own. Joe Sealey, to come back from a surgery and wrestle this season, is holding his own. And honestly, should have won. Should have won against his Illinois counterpart and didn't. Do not write these true freshmen off. They're not the starters. I get it. If these guys were asked to start, then the expectations were everything's on the line for them at the NCAA tournament. So then they got to they got to overperform and to make up for that gap right now with where they are developmentally. I maybe understand it to an extent, at least the frustration that, oh, Joe Sealey is not where he needs to be. No, because he's dealing with outside circumstances. He's dealing just with some bad luck. Cole Mirasola, same thing. It's all about time. Greg Kerkvliet wasn't ready to wrestle at heavyweight right out of the gate. He had to redshirt and go through and add the weight. Mirasola's on the same timeline. Cale is very strategic with all of this, so I will trust his decision-making here. I liked what I saw from Sealey, and especially knowing that what we know now, my expectations are much higher. Same thing with Mirasola. To give up 30, 40 pounds against his competition and not get a major decision against him, not get tech-falled, not get pinned, that's a lot. That's a positive. There are moral victories in sports. There's certainly some moral victories here. It's a victory, for college athletics? When, hey, wrestling's getting ready to add 30 scholarships in total. Penn State has more scholarships to offer its wrestlers. That's the good side of it. That's a win, but there's also a downside to it. We'll talk about the new scholarship limits. And Cale Sanderson got to share his thoughts in this recent media availability about it. We'll talk about it more coming up next here on Locked On Nittany Lions. The NCAA is raising the scholarship limit from 9.9 to 30, tripling the scholarship count for Penn State and everybody else. This is good news, right? This is a win. Not necessarily, and this is something that Cale highlighted in his press conference this week. And great question, Audrey Snyder of The Athletic. This is going to be a hot topic sooner rather than later when ultimately they go to, because now the government's involved, right? There's litigation, because the NCAA can't make its rules anymore. I don't need to get into all of that. What I do need to talk about is how the scholarship limits, the scholarship rule changes actually hurt. And I agree with Cale here. Penn State has over 30 wrestlers in its mat room. I think Cale said the number was either 37 or 38. He's lost count of how many people compete that are currently enrolled at Penn State but are not necessarily on scholarship. So there's the good that you get to reward some of these other wrestlers that aren't part of that 9.9 in the starting lineup. Why can't the NCAA just make it 10? 9.9, are we kidding? No wonder the NCAA is collapsing in real time. We see it with our own eyes that they're going to have to dissolve at some point here, and probably sooner rather than later. But they can't just make it 10 with the starting lineup. 9.9, really? Who decided that? How does that even get decided? Anyway, Penn State is going to be capped just like everybody else, where you can only have 30 wrestlers. You can't have any more. So when Cale talks about, hey, we have 37 or 38 wrestlers, competitors, but now we have to essentially cut 7 or 8 of them next season, and who knows, maybe even more. I don't know what the exact number is going to be, but you are going to have to cut to 30 and tell somebody, you can't wrestle here. Even if you like it, even if you enjoy it, the day of the walk-on is over, at least for the moment. And that's the bad news. That's the loss in all of this. And this is what Cale pointed out, how the walk-ons are some of the best supporters, that they help the program in other ways besides just, hey, they're strong competitors, they practice, they're good guys, they're great athletes that just, the iron sharpens iron. They're there. They help the program get better, even though they're not in the starting lineup or even necessarily on the depth chart. But now you have to tell 8, 10 to a dozen different guys that you can't compete here anymore because the NCAA says we're going to have 30 scholarship athletes, and that's not even mandatory in itself. Penn State has to be able to justify that they can carry 30 scholarships in the wrestling program. I would hope that they would, but there's the possibility that they don't. So you don't necessarily have to carry 30 scholarship athletes. You could, for example, carry 15. You could carry 20 because wrestling's so important at Penn State. I would imagine the number's probably going to be somewhere around, I don't think it's going to be any lower than 20. If it is, that would surprise me. I think that Penn State is going to have 20, at least, I'd say at least 25. I would say at least 25, but it's not a mandatory rule that you have to have 30 scholarship athletes. You just have the allotment. Just know, guess who is going to do that? Iowa, probably Oklahoma State. And if other schools like Ohio State and Michigan or NC State or Iowa State, any of those schools that are really on the outside looking in, they're going to probably want to do that to get back into the upper echelon here in college wrestling. So if Penn State decides against it, just know there are other programs out there, especially Iowa and Oklahoma State, that are not going to hesitate to have 30 scholarship wrestlers there. So there's good and bad with it. Almost seems like any decision that's really the case. But here's what needs to happen. Here's how you solve it. You allow for a practice squad, because at the end of the day, this isn't even about Penn State. This isn't even about giving scholarships out to wrestlers who definitely do deserve it. It's about telling athletes who are good enough to compete, are good enough to be a part of the practice squad, be a part of a hypothetical practice squad that can go in every day and train with a Carter Starachi, can train with a Levi Haynes, right? I can go up and down the lineup and name just about everybody. But they're not good enough to make the starting lineup. They're not good to be enough to be in a rotation, but they're good enough to practice there and to work at it. And we've seen in football where in wrestling, it's a little more difficult because there's only 10 starting spots. But in football, you see a guy like a Dom DeLuca. I hope the viewers and listeners know who that is from the wrestling audience. Dom DeLuca was a walk-on. This rule prevents players and people like him from making it in this sport, where you have to be great, elite to a certain extent, to make it in college athletics. And that's not right. So what they need to do is you have the scholarship allotment, but still allow for a quid pro quo, for the lack of a better term, or just a rule that allows for a practice squad so that you can still have these wrestlers compete. Because if Penn State wants them in the mat room, but they're not going to be in the starting lineup, how does that make any sense? How can you justify that at all? So above all else, this hurts the prospective athlete who maybe is not going to start in college, maybe wouldn't even crack a depth chart. But if Penn State or any other program in the NCAA views them as an athlete that can compete, and who knows, just because they're not one of the 30 best today doesn't mean that they couldn't be in a year, 2, 3 years time. Maybe they're a senior and they earn that scholarship. You're never going to know. They're never going to even have the opportunity unless there is that amendment to all of these new scholarship rules and NIL and the transfer portal. They have to add a practice squad element to this, or the NCAA is where it is for this exact reason. I feel like they can't make a good decision whatsoever. And this is why you have litigation involved. That's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Nittany Lions. I appreciate each and every one of you for checking out this episode. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments section, any questions that you have or reactions to this conversation. If you're new to the show, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. We do this daily, talking your favorite Penn State sports teams, Penn State football, Penn State wrestling, Penn State basketball, all right here on Locked On Nittany Lions. And again, thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. For your second listen and watch, you got to check out Locked On Big Ten with host Craig Sheeman. Craig puts the Big Ten first, covers all 18 teams in depth, and that's why it's called Locked On Big Ten. It's available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, and it's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.